We're beginning Chapter 3 of Emerging Viruses, AIDS, and Ebola, Nature, Accident, or Intentional. Cold War, Biological Weapons, and World Health. The Francis Countway Memorial Library is a stone's throw from Harvard School of Dental Medicine, where I had served on the faculty. A modern structure of glass and concrete, the building looks somewhat misplaced amid the grandeur of its centuries-old Gothic marble neighbors. What seemed ironically amusing about the building is that this tribute to health science learning would be diagnosed as a sick building. After a couple of hours in the Countway, people commonly became ill. Headaches and dizziness were the most frequent symptoms. The graduate students next door at the School of Public Health always joked that the library was contraindicated for women in their third trimester of pregnancy. Nevertheless, here's where I conducted most of my postdoctoral research. Access to Countway from Boston's North Shore was relatively painless. An hour's train ride dropped me off at the old Boston Garden. 2 transfers, and a half hour later I disembarked from the Huntington Avenue Street car on Harvard medical turf. A brief trek through 2 concrete corridors, a pair of glass doors, and a guarded gate, and I was at work. The first floor of Countway is mostly administrative offices, reference books, and online services. Computer literature searches are easily conducted here. The Index Medicus and current stacks are located down an open stairway on the first lower level. Current periodicals are neatly arranged on display shelves filling the south side of the gymnasium-sized floor. Work desks line the walls and are in great demand on the same sunny side of the room. The older stacks and copy machines are all in the basement. There is no natural light here and barely any oxygen. At the heart of this floor are 8 high-speed copiers. All are almost always in use, filling the room with heat and noise. Faculty and students alike await their turns seated uncomfortably at the center of the room on cracked black vinyl love seats. The lights flicker like a strobe. This is Countway's dungeon, where I assessed the scientific literature dating back to the late 1960s. Sweat and time quickly disappeared here. Prelude to a protocol. After our courtesy review of early WHO Chronicle reports, my search was for articles about biological warfare, BW. There were many. In February 1967, as international protests resounded against the Vietnam War, more than 5,000 domestic scientists petitioned President Lyndon Johnson and soon after Richard Nixon to re-examine and publicly state the government's research and deployment policies on chemical and biological weapons. Their request was met with stoic silence. Notes from White House Science Advisor Donald Horing to correspondents simply said, "Thank you for your interest in national security." The official government position on chemical and biological warfare, CBW, had been articulated by Deputy Defense Secretary Cyrus Vance a year earlier. I have indicated that we seek international understandings to limit chemical and biological warfare, and that we have not used weapons of the sort condemned by the Geneva Protocol. Though Agent Orange, the powerful defoliant, was being used heavily in Vietnam at that time, only later was it acknowledged to be highly toxic to humans as well. I should also point out that we have at the same time maintained an active chemical and biological program. In the last few years, we have placed increasing emphasis on defensive concepts and material. As long as other nations, such as the Soviet Union, maintain large programs, we believe we must maintain our defensive and relatory capability. It is believed by many that President Roosevelt's statement in 1943, which promised to any perpetrators, full and swift retaliation in kind played a significant role in preventing gas warfare in World War II. Until we achieve effective agreement to eliminate all stockpiles of these weapons, it may be necessary in the future to be in a position to make such a statement again. Worldwide protests. Between 1967 and 1972, debate raged over whether America's chemical biological weapons industry should be scrubbed or bolstered. Dr. Joshua Lederberg relayed the consensus of protesters in a 1971 Science article, Germ Warfare. He wrote, "Has been universally condemned as a vile perversion of scientific insight. The emotional reaction is buttressed by a rational consideration of the strategic and political instabilities that would follow from threatened U.S. uses of biological weapons and the possibilities of worldwide spread of infectious disease. In the interest of world order and to reduce the possibilities of igniting world conflict, the development, stockpiling, and general accommodation of biological weaponry must be controlled by international agreement." Lederberg, a professor of genetics at Stanford University's School of Medicine, described work in synthetic small gene assembly. He warned that very soon, though chemical operations on DNA components, researchers would be able to synthesize small viruses and engineer their design to exquisite detail. He argued that biological weapons stand apart from all other devices in the actual threat that it poses to health and life expectancy of every human being, whether or not he is politically involved in belligerent actions. In a word, the international release of an infectious particle, be it a virus or bacterium, from the confines of the laboratory or of medical practice must be condemned as an irresponsible threat against the whole human community. We have learned in recent years that viruses undergo constant evolution in their own natural history, not only mutations within a given strain, but also by the natural cross-hybridization of viruses that superficially appear to be only remotely related to one another. Furthermore, many of us carry viruses in our body cells of which we are unaware for years, and which may be harmless, though they may eventually cause the formation of a tumor or of brain degeneration or of other diseases. At least in the laboratory, we can show that such latent viruses can still crossbreed with other viruses to give rise to new forms. We are all familiar with the process of mutual escalation in which the defensive efforts of one side inevitably contribute to further technical development on the other and vice versa. And the potential undoubtedly exists for the design and development of infective agents against which no credible defense is possible. Through the genetic and chemical manipulation of these agents, Nature, Science, and Lancet published dozens of articles expressing grave concerns over the fate of humanity should biological weapons research continue. One such article, entitled "The Biological Bomb," written by an anonymous author, discussed the ethical implications of biological weapons research, an industry that lay at the heart of cellular nucleus, ticking us to destruction. Dr. V.W. Seidel, a Boston physician, declared that not only should medical personnel refuse to participate in such activities, but physicians must actively protest against the development, production, and use of biological weapons. Failure to do so, he argued, represented an insult to the medical profession, complicity, and one of the greatest dangers to society. Scientists could not retain public esteem if they did nothing about the present state of the world, declaring another protester. The delicate balance between good and evil was changing rapidly, and the present juncture was seen as crucial. In Britain, several groups frustrated by the secrecy surrounding experiments conducted at Porton's, England's chemical biological weapons research facility lobbied their governments to. Protesters included Nobel Prize winners Professor Sir Cyril Powell, Professor H.F. Wilkins, and Dr. F. Sanger. All desired to have the Ministry of Health assume responsibility for Porton from the Ministry of Defense to assure that all chemical biological weapons research would be strictly defensive. Another English notable, Lord Ritchie Calder, summoned support for an international biological weapons accord and halted one group of scientists who were devoted to preventing disease over another who was busy devising man-made epidemics. Likewise, another anonymous author published in Lancet, "The whole field of biological warfare bristles with difficulty. Organisms for biological warfare can be produced quickly, cheaply, and easily. Many are required in ordinary and perfectly legitimate ways for production of vaccines. Clandestine research could easily be conducted. Storage is scarcely necessary for chemical plants, and even breweries could be quickly switched to producing harmful microorganisms in enormous quantities, and delivery systems are multiple. The government could give a sound basis to its Geneva proposal by declaring all future work carried out at Porton declassified. This would carry especial conviction if it were linked to participation with WHO. In 1963, Professor Roger M. Harriet of the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health suggested that the United States should offer to place its biological laboratories under WHO if Russia and some other countries agreed to do the same. The risks to national security in this procedure are a good deal less than might be thought. For despite all the secrecy, it seems to be difficult for any country to steal a march on another in this. Oh my goodness. It seems to be difficult for any country to steal a march on another in this sphere where the essential basic knowledge is so readily attainable. These large and frankly political questions may hardly seem of pressing concern to the medical profession, but biological warfare implies a misuse of medical science for which doctors cannot evade responsibility. Medical knowledge and medical participation are inherent in most of its projects, and the profession's silence on this issue is liable to be interpreted as consent. The secrecy demanded is also contrary to the principles of medical ethics and is totally rejected in every other medical activity. If the fetters of secrecy were discarded and an international orientation adopted, more immediate and constructive thought could be given to feeding the world's 1,000 million undernourished citizens. Though this author's heart was in the right place, I thought it naive to think that placing all biological laboratories under the WHO's control would have made any difference. Americans were sharing secrets with the Russians through the WHO network anyway. Moreover, the WHO made it clear that security wasn't an issue. They expressed their objections who safeguarded DNA research this way. The requirements for high-security laboratories may be an inordinate burden. Who, in fact, will pay for them in relation to the prospective gains? The best strategy here seems to be the development of safe vectors, plasmids, and bacteria engineered to have little chance of survival outside the laboratory. In fact, in the long run, this is a safer procedure than relying upon uncertain human compliance with fixed rules and regulations. Discussing the remaining controversies in this field of genetic splicing and hazardous germ development techniques that require rather complicated analysis of the remotest kinds of risks, WHO reported. Those who regard themselves as guardians of the public safety must count not only the speculative hazards of these marginal situations, but also the costs of the public health of impeding their investigation. This partly voluntaristic recommended approach will not satisfy a demand for absolute assurance that no foolish experiment is ever attempted. But the history of human institutions should suffice to show that no system of sanctions can have such a perfect outcome. These were the WHO's reservations to safeguarding hazardous gene research, despite the fact that the one who brought the issue of increasing security to the floor of WHO debate was Professor Leonard. The world-renowned geneticist Leonard at the time was serving as a member of the WHO's Advisory Committee on Medical Research, the proponent to chemical biological weapons research. My computer search also revealed that through opponents of CBW research appeared to outnumber proponents by at least 3-1. The typical biological weapons advocacy position was expressed in numerous publications. Donald McCary, in Science, for instance, wrote, "What is apparently overlooked and totally ignored by these petitioners is that the war in Vietnam is not an academic exercise divorced from life and death. It is a very real exercise in how to achieve a goal, however distasteful, with a minimum of casualties among our own combat personnel. I believe that any technique, weapon, tactic, or strategy that will minimize casualties among our combat personnel is right, and any technique, tactic, or strategy that preserves the combat effectiveness of our opponent is wrong." But in March 1970, even the WHO consultants noted that all biological agents permit the danger that if a disease capable of spreading widely is produced, it may get out of control and become a source of disaster to the attacker as well as the attacked. The viral infections suitable for use in warfare include yellow fever, tick-borne encephalitis, Japanese encephalitis, dengue, Venezuelan equine encephalitis, VEE, chikungunya, o Nyang, Rift Valley fever, influenza, and smallpox. Tick-borne encephalitis may be taken as an example of the agents belonging to this group. Susceptibility is almost universal, and the ease with which the Far Eastern virus can be grown in the laboratory and its high infectivity and lethality by the aerosol route make it likely that a case fatality rate of 25% would be achieved. The attacking country could, of course, attempt to protect itself, e.g. by immunization, but more virulent forms of the organism concerned might develop, or the massive doses used might be such that ordinary levels of immunity would be useless. Thus, it is possible that biological agents may be used tactically rather than strategically to achieve the simultaneous infection of key groups of people, and the military consequences might be of major importance. A discussion to develop chemical and biological weapons implies that they will ultimately be used, emphasis added. The consultants even predicted a virulent mutant that could spread rapidly to produce an uncontrollable epidemic on a large scale. In addition, they warned, if mutants were deliberately produced, there was the ever-persistent risk of an accidental escape. Psychological consequences. WHO consultants additionally predicted grave psychological consequences of such an escape, including mass hysteria. They thus present a real danger that is conducive to both anxiety and fear. Anxiety in particular may result from the fact that many chemical and all biological agents are undetectable by the senses, so that there are no warning signs to enable people to defend themselves. In addition, with biological agents, There is the latent period between infection and illness, and the fact that the extent to which an infection may spread through a community is unpredictable. As a result, an exposed person cannot be sure whether he has been infected or know how ill he will be or when the danger is past. A further confusing factor is that many of the symptoms of illnesses are also symptoms of emotional stress. That sounded remarkably similar to the fear of the AIDS epidemic I had frequently written and talked about. In the event of an attack, the researcher added, panic may be so great. Those who... I gotta start that over. Panic may be so great that those who have not been affected will view those who have as potential agents of disease. The response to a chemical or biological attack may require precautionary or other measures on such a scale that extraordinary means of social control will have to be introduced, and these may remain in force long after the need for them has passed. Thus, an attack may lead to social changes out of all proportion to the actual damage done. Isn't that interesting, I thought. They even predicted social changes like the need to legislate AIDS as a disability rather than a disease, and requiring infection control measures that have yet to prove their value in saving costs or lives. WHO consultants further predicted that the masses would try to avoid anything that would bring them in contact with deadly germs. Much of this avoidance was expected to be disproportionate to the actual risk. In my role as a health professional AIDS educator, I recalled several similar experiences. One had occurred a few weeks earlier following a television interview in Rockford, Illinois. A viewer called me at the station to express her concern about leaving her house. The last time she went shopping, she said a storekeeper handed her a box of laundry detergent. She noticed a few cuts on his hand and refused to touch him or the box. She just panicked, left the store, and hadn't gone shopping since. Even though casual contact can't transmit HIV, I said to the station receptionist, people are still afraid, especially of shaking hands with AIDS patients or HIV carriers. Exactly what was predicted, I reflected. Besides this, the consultants even envisioned extensive health and medical emergencies as a consequence of a biological attack, including mass illness, deaths, and epidemics. They expected that WHO might be called upon to furnish technical assistance in dealing with allegations that chemical or biological weapons had been used, and in achieving disarmament, the author concluded. As long as research on the military use of chemical and biological agents is continued, new agents of greater destructive power may be discovered. It is clear, therefore, that the best interests of all member states, to say nothing of mankind in general, require that the development and use of chemical and biological agents as weapons of war be outlawed in all circumstances. The nations of the world must renounce the use of such weapons in accordance with the resolutions on chemical and biological warfare adopted by the United Nations General Assembly and the World Health Assembly. Sadly, I realized their notice fell before blind eyes. Army medical scientists allegedly wanted vaccines and diagnostic methods developed quickly in the event of a viral attack. Between 1967 and 1968, the Johnson administration languished amid cries for America's withdrawal from Vietnam. Richard Nixon was then propelled to the White House, and soon thereafter toward detente. Superficially, under Nixon, the world seemed safer, but in the viral research laboratories of the NIH, the Cold War raged. During this time, the National Cancer Institute, under the National Institute of Health Administrative Direction, provided the CDC with prototype reagents, viruses, vaccines, and antibodies, and cell lines as the American and International Viral Research Program advanced. Who bit first, the Texan or the simian? Once we considered the Cold War climate in which bioweapons research advanced, we reviewed the WHO's written accounts of the NIH's and NCI's primary role in manufacturing prototype viruses, including new strains of simian viruses, for world distribution and testing. In 1969, the WHO Chronicle reported, representative working stocks and vaccines for various viruses are being prepared and tested. The distribution of these agents will be through WHO or the National Institute of Health, or on their instructions. Obviously, certain limitations must be imposed on distribution, as it will be impossible to produce sufficient amounts of the reagents to send them out indiscriminately. Reference reagents also have been prepared in the center, the WHO Immunology Laboratories at Lausanne, as well as in other cooperating laboratories. Under the auspices of the Research Reference Reagents Branch and National Cancer Institute, U.S. National Institutes of Health, emphasis added. For many of the prototype human viruses and, to a more limited extent for simian viruses, reagents prepared against newly recognized simian viruses will be distributed only to recognized investigators in primate research. Another WHO report added, and as additional means of providing advanced training, 3 meetings on the joint activities of WHO virus reference centers and national virus laboratories have been held, one in Atlanta in 1967, one in Prague in 1968, and one in Dakar in 1968. At these meetings, most of the time was devoted to laboratory benchwork. They were designed not only to disseminate information on recent advances and on new techniques, but also to foster closer relations between regional reference centers and national laboratories. Isn't that nice, Jackie observed. Closer relations and germ warfare method and material exchange between NATO allies and communist bloc countries at the height of the Cold War. After another hour of reading, Jackie said, I'm going to bed. Are you coming? Wait till you read this, I replied. Haven't you read enough for one day? You know the theory that a simian monkey bite caused an African to get AIDS. I said, well, here's a report by 2 doctors from San Antonio that suggests that the simian may have first been bitten by a Texan. What? I showed her the article and pointed to the section that explained that in 1969, WHO encouraged researchers to use simian monkeys as animals phylogenetically close to man. They recommended establishing biomedical systems that will permit the evaluation of different zoonoses, infections, or infestations shared in nature by man and lower animals to yield information on human disease. WHO scientists were concerned about the potential risk of introducing a new group or species of such animals into research. This might be potentially dangerous for both the animals and the investigators. I explained. They noted that an exchange of organisms might occur from the laboratory into nature, affecting both animals and man, that in most instances resulted in inapparent and latent infections rather than in overt illness. Here, read this. No, I'm tired. Read it to me in bed. We marched off to the bedroom, got settled, and then I began to read. It says here that overt human and non-human illness is possible, as it apparently occurred with herpes virus simile disease, Yabda-like disease, and hemorrhagic disease. The outbreak in Germany associated with African green monkeys and the spread of a number of bacterial infections. This is nightmare material, Jackie protested. Wait, I continued to read. The importance of such occurrences is enhanced by the fact that simians come from diverse geographical areas. A possibility exists, therefore, that new and exotic agents may be transported internationally, introducing an unrecognized clinical syndrome into the animal colonies and perhaps into the human population as well. Thus, while the use of non-human primates in certain experimental studies is to be condemned, disregarded for the potential problems would be foolhardily indeed. The report goes on to say that despite their concerns, the authors reported working with various governmental agencies as well as commercial firms to obtain reference seed virus and specific antisera for dozens of monkey types and related diseases. With funding from the NIH and methods and material from the NCI, the doctors continued to grow their simian monkey viruses until the WHO ordained them the WHO Collaborating Laboratory on Comparative Medicine. Simian viruses, they're located at the Southwest Foundation for Research and Education, currently called the Southwest Foundation for Biomedical Research. Listen to their specific aims. 1. The development of a working repository for simian viruses. 2. The provision of a source of reagents such as certified reference seed virus strains and specific antisera. 3. The provision of consultation services, including serum survey data on the existence of antibody to various viruses of human and simian origin in various genera and species of primates. 4. The provision of diagnostic services, including the identification and characterization of viruses for primate research workers unable to identify isolates obtained from their primates. This would also include screening for human viruses. 5. The provision of information and the organization of exchanges of organisms between primate centers and other health organizations. And 6. The training of interested students in virological laboratory procedures associated with primate investigations. And here again they stated they received their working stocks of viruses and antisera from the NIH's Research Reference Reagents branch as well as from the NCI, and that they were now creating their own new forms of viruses and vaccines. Sounds like a clearinghouse for simian viruses, Jackie responded with one eye open. Just what the world needed. Now we can go to sleep. Not yet. Consider the financial payoff. They already acknowledged working with private companies. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, they stockpiled everything that might be needed and undoubtedly lucrative in the event of a future simian virus outbreak. They clearly acknowledged the Marburg virus outbreak in Europe and Africa as a sign of times to come. It also says that they would continue their present cooperation with investigators using primates in cancer studies. What's interesting, I continued, is that they blamed the monkeys for transmitting these newly discovered viruses, which they most plausibly isolated, cultured, and then inoculated into animals. Here's how they closed. Perhaps it should be re-emphasized that there is a very practical important side to this program. Recent outbreaks of human and simian disease in several centers handling simian indicate that these animals are responsible for the transmission of the etiological agents. How treasonous, Jackie chuckled. The monkeys asked to be jailed so they could later be held responsible for their crimes against humanity. How dare they transmit deadly viruses back to the humans who were infecting them? I joined the comic relief. Yeah, maybe instead of 3 monkeys symbolizing denial, it should be the 3 NCI virologists with their eyes, ears, and mouths covered. The last thing it says is that it is highly probable that more such incidents can be expected. The work to be done at the center will do much to evaluate and elucidate the situation, and the center may be called upon for assistance. That's the best example, I think, I've ever heard of successful entrepreneurs creating their own niche market, Jackie chided. Early cancer research under WHO. The next morning, after getting Alina, now 3, off to daycare, Jackie and I reviewed the last of the WHO's viral research reports. We immediately learned that the WHO's intensified interest in viruses dated from around 1950 with the initiation of their smallpox eradication program. Initially, a number of countries generously donated smallpox vaccine to the WHO, special account for smallpox eradication, and by 1971, more than 37 million doses had been distributed, with Russian contributions outpacing Americans by more than 2 to 1. Yet, despite such international investments, the mammoth undertaking, we learned, returned only mixed results since many vaccinated countries experienced repeated outbreaks of deadly smallpox. Besides smallpox, the WHO Chronicles stated the importance of viral infections on cancer as early as 1965. The WHO's scientific group on viruses and cancer met in Geneva that year to plan a common research agenda. The group, comprised of international representatives, including 3 from the United States and 1 from Russia, cited they need to study viruses since cancer cells maintain altered genetic material. Consequently, they recommended attempts be made to determine the structural alterations in cellular nucleic acids, that is the basic chemical building blocks of all life. They desired to search for all parts of the virus genome, the genetic makeup or reproductive blueprint of the viruses, their chemical reaction triggers or enzymes or other virus-associated intercellular substances. They ordered study of the specific changes in the metabolism of virus-infected cells and wrote, any genetic structure peculiar to viruses suspected of causing cancer should be identified and mapped out. Immunological methods might prove of value, since virus-transformed cells carry antigenic, that is, foreign chemical markers. A first step in such research would be to induce transformation cancers in various experimental animals with viruses that commonly infect man. The group also suggested that, although there is no reason at present to suspect transmission of animal cancer viruses to man, any possible relationship that might exist between bovine cow lymphosarcoma, cancer of the lymphatic cells and tissue, or other mammalian leukemias, and human leukemia should be explored, both by epidemiological studies and by laboratory research on suspected etiological agents. That's exactly what Strecker alleged brought on the AIDS epidemic, I said. Could this research have really created HIV and AIDS-related diseases like lymphomas and sarcomas? Hot viruses during the Cold War. It soon became obvious by the late 1960s the WHO's viral research program shifted into hyperactive. After reading several papers about their major advances, my attention focused on additional written confirmation of the United States Public Health Services and the National Cancer Institute's leading role in the World Health Organization's viral and cancer research programs. Perhaps not coincidentally, at the exact time the Defense Department petitioned Congress to fund their AIDS-like virus project, the WHO announced its Center for Viral Research and recommended it was the National Cancer Institute. By 1968, 10 years into the viral research program, the National Cancer Institute and WHO reference centers in Copenhagen, Denmark, and Lausanne, Switzerland, had served as authorized technical advisors and suppliers of prototype virus strains, diagnostic and reference agents, e.g. antibodies, antigens, and cell cultures, for more than 120 laboratories in 35 different countries. Within a year of this announcement, this number increased to 592 virus laboratories. Only 137 were outside Europe and North America. Over these 12 months, 4 of the most active centers, including the CDC and NCI, distributed 2,514 strains of viruses, 1,888 ampules of antisera, mainly for reference purposes, 1,274 ampules of antigens, and about 100 samples of cell cultures. More than 70,000 individual reports of virus isolations or related serological tests had been transmitted through the WHO network. This sounds like something out of a James Bond novel, Jackie responded. I expect to read the word Spectre any minute now. Instead, we read that the NIH in Bethesda and the National Communicable Disease Center in Atlanta, the predecessor of the CDC, had made great progress in testing vaccines produced in large quantities in horses. We soon learned that the horses were actually stabled and tested in Frederick, Maryland at Fort Detrick, America's premier biological weapons testing center, and also the location of the National Cancer Institute now. We'll pick up Chapter 4. The road to Fort Detrick runs through Bethesda tomorrow.